The heavy oak doors of the Oval Office burst open with such force that the Secret Service agents outside barely had time to recognize the familiar silhouette before Tucker Carlson strode past them, his usually composed demeanor replaced by something far more volatile. The scent of expensive cigars hung thick in the air, mingling with the satisfaction that seemed to radiate from the cluster of military brass surrounding the resolute desk. President Trump stood at the center of it all, his hand extended in congratulatory handshakes with generals whose chest ribbons caught the light from the crystal chandelier above. The scene looked like something from a different era, powerful men in expensive suits celebrating what they clearly considered a triumph of American strength and precision. "Mr. President," Tucker's voice cut through the self-congratulatory murmur like a blade through silk. "Congratulations. You've just become everything you once stood against." The room fell silent with the abruptness of a record player being yanked from its socket. General McKenzie's hand froze mid-shake, his weathered face turning toward the unexpected intruder. Defense Secretary Austin's smile evaporated as he recognized the Fox News host whose primetime show had become appointment television for millions of conservative Americans. Trump's blue eyes locked onto Tucker's with the intensity of a man who had spent decades reading rooms and understanding when the political winds were about to shift. The president's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, a tell that those who knew him best had learned to recognize as the precursor to either calculated charm or devastating counterattack. "Gentlemen," Trump said without breaking eye contact with Tucker, his voice carrying the unmistakable authority of the most powerful office on earth, "I believe our business here is concluded. Thank you for your excellent work tonight." The dismissal was polite but absolute. Within moments, the Oval Office had emptied of all but two men: the President of the United States and the media personality who had just accused him of fundamental betrayal in front of the nation's top military leadership. Tucker stepped forward, his producer's instincts telling him to position himself where the light from the desk lamp would cast the most dramatic shadows across his face. This wasn't just a confrontation, it was television, even without cameras rolling. "Dick Cheney must be laughing somewhere," Tucker began, his voice carrying the measured cadence that had made him one of the most influential voices in conservative media. "John Bolton is probably uncorking champagne as we speak. This is exactly what they wanted, to drag you into their endless game of global chess where American soldiers are the pawns." Trump moved behind his desk with the fluid grace of a man who had learned to use physical space as psychological leverage. His fingers drummed once against the leather desktop. Another tell, though this one suggested calculation rather than irritation. "Tucker," the president said, his voice carrying the slight rasp that came from decades of public speaking, "you're talking like someone who's never held intelligence briefings about dead Americans in his hands." The words hung in the air between them like smoke from an extinguished match. Tucker felt something shift in his chest, not doubt, exactly, but the first recognition that this conversation might not unfold as he had expected. Every military engagement in our history started with dead Americans and the promise of swift justice, Tucker countered, stepping closer to the desk. Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, they all began with righteous anger and ended with, "Well, we both know how they ended." Trump's expression remained unreadable, but something flickered behind his eyes, a momentary glimpse of the weight that came with making decisions that could reshape the global order. He reached into his desk drawer, his movements deliberate and measured. "You want to talk about righteous anger?" Trump asked, his voice dropping to a register that somehow made the spacious office feel smaller. "You want to discuss the difference between smart strength and endless conflicts?" From the drawer, Trump withdrew a manila folder marked with classification stamps that Tucker recognized but had never seen outside of movies. The president's fingers moved to the metal clasp with surprising gentleness, as if the contents were somehow fragile despite their obvious importance. "This," Trump said, opening the folder and turning it toward Tucker, "is why I authorized precise strikes against Iranian nuclear facilities tonight." The photographs were glossy and professional, the kind taken by military photographers who understood that documentation was sometimes the only way to honor sacrifice. Tucker found himself looking at images of young Americans in uniform, their faces peaceful in death, but somehow accusatory in their stillness. Staff Sergeant Maria Rodriguez, 26, from Phoenix. Specialist David Chun, 22, from Sacramento. Corporal James Mitchell, 24, from Birmingham. Each photograph was accompanied by a brief summary. Rocket attack on forward operating base Freedom, 17 casualties, Iranian-manufactured missiles. Tucker felt his carefully constructed argument beginning to fracture around the edges. These weren't statistics or talking points. They were someone's children, someone's spouses, someone's friends who had gone to sleep in what they thought was a secure facility and never woken up. "Look at them, Tucker," Trump said, his voice carrying an undertone that the media personality had never heard before, something that might have been grief, or rage, or both. "Look at Maria Rodriguez and tell me I should have sent a strongly worded letter to Tehran instead of responding with precision and strength." The room seemed to contract around the photographs, the weight of presidential responsibility suddenly made tangible in a way that Tucker's commentary had never quite captured. He could feel his principles warring with his emotions, his ideology struggling against the undeniable humanity of the faces staring up at him from the classified folder. "Mr. President," Tucker began, his voice not quite as steady as it had been moments before, "every conflict in our history has started with photographs just like these. Every president has stood exactly where you're standing, holding exactly these kinds of images, believing that this time would be different." Trump closed the folder with the same deliberate care he had used to open it, his eyes never leaving Tucker's face. The president's expression had shifted subtly, less defensive now, more analytical, as if he were examining a particularly complex business deal rather than defending a military operation. "The difference," Trump said, sliding the folder back into his drawer, "is that I'm not planning to occupy Iran, rebuild their government, or turn their country into a laboratory for democracy. We eliminated specific threats with surgical precision, and now their leadership understands that attacking Americans has consequences." Tucker straightened, feeling his journalistic instincts reassert themselves despite the emotional impact of the photographs. This was the moment that would define not just this conversation, but potentially the entire direction of American foreign policy for the next 4 years. "And what happens when they retaliate?" Tucker asked, his voice regaining its characteristic intensity. "What happens when China decides to test your resolve in the South China Sea? Or when Russia pushes further into Ukraine because they've seen that America is willing to engage in military action again?" Trump's smile was subtle but unmistakable, the expression of a man who had been waiting for exactly this question. He moved around the desk until he was standing directly in front of Tucker, close enough that the media personality could see the fatigue lines around the president's eyes that television cameras rarely captured. "Then they'll learn the same lesson Iran learned tonight," Trump said, his voice carrying the quiet confidence that had made him a formidable negotiator long before he entered politics. "That America first doesn't mean America alone. It means America unafraid." The silence that followed was pregnant with implications that both men understood, but neither wanted to articulate. Tucker felt the foundations of his argument shifting beneath him like sand, while Trump recognized the look of a man whose certainties were being challenged by realities he had never been forced to confront. Outside the Oval Office windows, Washington, D.C. continued its restless existence, unaware that the future of American foreign policy was being debated in hushed tones behind bulletproof glass. The weight of leadership, its terrible clarity and impossible choices, hung between them like a challenge that only one of them would ever have to accept. "Then explain to me," Trump said finally, his voice carrying the steel that had made him both loved and feared across the political spectrum, "how you would have protected Americans tonight, Tucker. Tell me what you would have done if you had the power to act instead of just the luxury to criticize." Tucker felt the weight of Trump's challenge settle around him like a heavy coat. The president's question hung in the air between them, sharp, personal, and impossible to deflect with the usual media tactics. For a moment, the Fox News host found himself in unfamiliar territory, being asked to provide solutions rather than critique them. "You want to know what I would have done?" Tucker said, his voice regaining its characteristic intensity. "I would have remembered every promise you made to the American people about ending our involvement in overseas conflicts. I would have recalled your own words about how smart presidents find ways to achieve objectives without expanding military operations." He began to pace, his movement transforming the static confrontation into something more dynamic. This was Tucker in his element, constructing arguments, building narrative momentum, wielding words like precision instruments. "You stood on debate stages in 2016 and criticized Hillary Clinton for wanting to escalate tensions with Iran," Tucker continued, his tone carrying the authority of someone who had covered every moment of those campaigns. "You called her a hawk, a creature of the establishment who would drag America into another Middle Eastern quagmire. What changed?" Trump watched the pacing with the patience of a man who had weathered countless such performances. His fingers steepled beneath his chin, a gesture that his closest advisors recognized as the precursor to either concession or total demolition of his opponent's position. "What changed?" Trump said, his voice carrying the measured tone of someone choosing his words with surgical precision, "is that I became responsible for protecting American lives instead of just commenting on how others do it." The president moved to the wall where portraits of his predecessors gazed down with expressions ranging from stern determination to weary resignation. His finger traced the air near Lincoln's frame without quite touching the glass. "You want to talk about historical precedent?" Trump continued. "Let's discuss Ronald Reagan in 1986. Gaddafi sponsored an attack on American soldiers in Berlin, a discotheque, if memory serves. What did Reagan do? He didn't send diplomatic notes or organize international sanctions. He authorized precise strikes on Libyan targets, and suddenly Libya lost its enthusiasm for supporting attacks on Americans." Tucker's jaw tightened. He recognized the tactical shift. Trump was moving the conversation from emotional ground to intellectual territory, where both men could engage as equals rather than as commander-in-chief and media critic. Reagan's situation was different, Tucker countered, stopping his pacing to face the president directly. The cold context was clear: proxy conflicts with defined parameters. This is the Middle East in 2025, where every action creates 10 reactions, where precision strikes become extended engagements, where surgical operations metastasize into something nobody intended. "Exactly my point," Trump said, turning from the portraits with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Reagan understood something that modern critics seem to have forgotten, that showing weakness invites aggression, while demonstrating strength creates respect and, ultimately, stability. The intellectual duel was now fully engaged, both men drawing on decades of studying power, politics, and the mechanics of global influence. Tucker felt his argumentative instincts sharpen as he recognized familiar ground. "But every president believes their situation is unique," Tucker pressed. "Johnson thought Vietnam would be different from Korea. Bush believed Iraq would be different from Vietnam. Obama convinced himself that Libya would be different from Iraq. They all started with limited objectives and righteous justification." Trump's expression shifted subtly, less defensive now, more engaged in the pure intellectual exercise of the debate. This was the kind of discussion he had missed during his first presidency, when most conversations were filtered through layers of advisors and political calculation. "The difference," Trump said, moving back toward his desk with deliberate steps, "is that I'm not interested in rebuilding societies or exporting democracy. I authorize strikes on specific nuclear facilities that pose direct threats to American interests. Period. No ground troops, no occupation, no nation-building fantasies." "And when Iran responds?" Tucker asked, leaning forward with the intensity of a prosecutor delivering a key question. "When they close the Strait of Hormuz, or activate sleeper cells in European capitals, or accelerate their nuclear program in hidden facilities we don't know about. What then?" The question hung between them like a chess piece hovering over the board, both players calculating the implications of the next move. Trump's fingers drummed once against the desk, that telegram, suggesting deeper thoughts than his expression revealed. "Then we'll respond proportionally and precisely," Trump said. "But Tucker, you're operating under a fundamental misunderstanding of how deterrence works in the modern world. Weakness doesn't prevent escalation, it guarantees it." Tucker felt something shift in the rhythm of their exchange. There was something in Trump's voice, a note he hadn't heard before. Not quite uncertainty, but perhaps the weight of decisions that went beyond political calculation into territory where real consequences followed abstract choices. "You think this was easy for me?" Trump asked suddenly, his voice dropping to a register that seemed to come from someplace deeper than his usual public persona. "You think I sat in this office tonight and casually authorized military action because it felt politically convenient?" The president moved to the window overlooking the South Lawn, his silhouette outlined against the bulletproof glass that separated him from the world outside. For a moment, the powerful figure seemed smaller, more human, a man carrying burdens that couldn't be shared or delegated. "I sat here for 6 hours, Trump continued, his voice barely above a whisper. 6 hours looking at intelligence reports, casualty assessments, diplomatic cables. I called 4 former presidents, Democrats and Republicans, asking for their counsel. I prayed, Tucker. When was the last time you heard me admit to praying about anything?" Tucker felt his carefully constructed argument beginning to fragment around the edges. This wasn't the Trump he expected to encounter, the bombastic performer, or the calculating politician. This was something more complex and infinitely more difficult to categorize. The easy decision, Trump said, turning back from the window, would have been to do nothing. Send diplomatic protests, impose economic sanctions, let the international community handle it through committees and resolutions. That's what Washington expects. Endless process without resolution, the appearance of action without the risk of consequence. The president's eyes locked onto Tucker's with an intensity that made the media personality suddenly aware of the isolation that came with ultimate responsibility. Every decision Trump made would ripple outward through history, affecting millions of lives in ways that could never be fully calculated or controlled. But 17 Americans died because Iran thought they could test our resolve, Trump continued, his voice regaining its characteristic strength. And if I had done nothing, there would have been 17 more next month, and 17 more after that, until Iran concluded that America had become a paper tiger. Tucker found himself in the unfamiliar position of wanting to respond but lacking the words. The emotional weight of Trump's admission, the humanity behind the political calculation, was shifting the entire foundation of their debate. So yes, Trump said, returning to his desk and settling into the chair that had held every president since Taft, I authorized precise strikes on Iranian nuclear facilities. Not because I wanted to, but because the alternative was to let American service members become targets of convenience for every regional power looking to test our commitment. The silence that followed was profound, not empty, but full of implications that both men understood but neither wanted to voice. Tucker could feel his principles warring with the sudden recognition that governing required choices that commentary could never adequately capture. And what if you're wrong? Tucker asked finally, his voice carrying less conviction than before but retaining its essential challenge. What if this isn't the beginning of deterrence, but the beginning of something much larger? What if Iran decides that the only appropriate response is to make this conflict so costly that America regrets ever getting involved? The question settled over the Oval Office like smoke from an extinguished fire. Acrid, lingering, impossible to ignore. The pause that followed Tucker's question stretched between them like a taut wire, both men recognizing that they had reached the fundamental core of their disagreement. Trump stood slowly, his movement carrying the deliberate weight of someone who had learned to use silence as effectively as words. He walked to the window again, but this time his gaze seemed to penetrate beyond the south lawn to some distant horizon that only he could see. The weight of the office, its terrible clarity and impossible choices, seemed to settle around his shoulders like an invisible mantle. Tucker, Trump said finally, his voice carrying a philosophical weight that the media personality had rarely heard from any politician. There's something you need to understand about this job that no amount of commentary or analysis can teach you. The president turned back toward the room, his expression reflecting something that might have been weariness or wisdom or both. Every morning, I wake up knowing that the decisions I make today will echo through history in ways I can't possibly predict. Every intelligence briefing brings me information about threats that 99.9% of Americans will never know existed. Every conversation with foreign leaders carries the potential to prevent or precipitate conflicts that could reshape the global order. Tucker remained silent, recognizing that something fundamental had shifted in their exchange. This was no longer a debate between political opponents. It had become something more intimate, more revealing of the costs that came with ultimate power. You ask what if I'm wrong, Trump continued, moving behind his desk with the fluid grace of someone completely comfortable in the space. Let me ask you something in return. What if I'm right? What if those precision strikes prevented a larger conflict? What if Iran's leadership is now reconsidering their strategy instead of planning their next attack? The president's fingers moved to another drawer, this one secured with a combination lock that he opened with practiced ease. From within, he withdrew a single envelope, its edges worn as if it had been handled many times. Leadership, Trump said, holding the envelope with surprising gentleness, isn't about making popular decisions or maintaining ideological purity. It's about accepting responsibility for consequences that extend far beyond your own political survival. He opened the envelope and removed a handwritten letter, its pages covered in the careful script of someone unaccustomed to writing but determined to be heard. Tucker could see even from his position that the paper showed signs of tears, water stains that spoke of grief too profound for mere words. This arrived yesterday, Trump said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. From Patricia Rodriguez in Phoenix, Arizona. Mother of Staff Sergeant Maria Rodriguez, one of the young people whose photograph I showed you earlier. Trump's eyes moved across the letter's contents with the careful attention of someone reading scripture. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of personal obligation that transcended political calculation. She doesn't ask for revenge, Tucker. She doesn't demand military action or political rhetoric. She asks for one thing, that her daughter's sacrifice means something. That the people responsible for taking Maria away from her understand that America protects its own. The president looked up from the letter, his eyes meeting Tucker's with an intensity that made the media personality suddenly aware of the crushing weight of presidential responsibility. You want to know the difference between us? Trump asked, his voice regaining its characteristic strength while maintaining its philosophical depth. You have the luxury of principles without consequences. I have the burden of decisions that affect real people in real time. Tucker felt something fundamental shifting within his understanding of power and its obligations. The philosophical arguments that had seemed so clear moments before were now complicated by the human element. The faces of service members, the grief of their families, the impossible calculus of protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. When you go home tonight, Trump continued, you'll write your commentary about how I've betrayed conservative principles. You'll construct elegant arguments about the dangers of foreign intervention and the wisdom of restraint. And you'll sleep peacefully knowing that your principles remain pure and untested. The president stood and moved around the desk until he was directly in front of Tucker, close enough that the media personality could see the fatigue lines that television cameras rarely captured. The weight of decisions that aged a man faster than time alone ever could. But he'll go upstairs knowing that 17 American families received folded flags instead of living children. And he'll wake up tomorrow knowing that my decision to respond with precision and strength either prevented 17 more such deliveries or started a chain of events that could lead to thousands more. Trump's voice carried no anger now, only the quiet authority of someone who had accepted burdens that few people could ever understand. The political performer had been replaced by something more authentic and infinitely more complex. You ask about the costs and risks, Trump continued. Every decision carries costs and risks. But there's one risk you haven't considered, the cost of doing nothing. The signal that American lives can be taken without consequence. The invitation for every regional power to test our resolve until testing becomes routine. Tucker found himself in the unprecedented position of being genuinely uncertain about his response. The human elements Trump had introduced, the photographs, the letter, the personal weight of responsibility, had shifted the entire framework of their debate. Peace through strength, Trump said, returning to his desk and carefully replacing the letter in its envelope, doesn't mean peace through passivity. It means that potential adversaries understand the consequences of aggression before they choose to act. The president's eyes moved to the portraits on the wall, Lincoln, who had preserved the Union through unimaginable bloodshed, Roosevelt, who had led America through depression and global conflict, Reagan, who had ended the cold engagement through strength rather than accommodation. Every president in those portraits, Trump said, following Tucker's gaze, faced moments when their principles collided with their responsibilities. When the easy path of inaction competed with the difficult path of decisive leadership. Trump settled back into his chair, the leather creaking softly under his weight. His expression had evolved throughout their conversation from defensive to analytical to something approaching paternal, the look of someone who had learned hard lessons and was trying to share their wisdom. You still think I made the wrong choice, Trump said. It wasn't a question, but an observation delivered without accusation or defensiveness. Tucker realized that the president was right. Despite everything, the photographs, the letter, the weight of responsibility so clearly evident in Trump's demeanor, he still believed that military action was the wrong response. But something had changed in his understanding of why people made such choices. I do think you made the wrong choice, Tucker said finally, his voice carrying less conviction than before but maintaining its essential honesty. But I understand now why you made it. Trump's smile was slight but genuine, the expression of someone who had achieved something more valuable than agreement, understanding. That's the difference between us, Tucker, Trump said, his voice carrying neither triumph nor regret. You can afford to be wrong about principles. I can't afford to be wrong about protecting American lives. The silence that followed was different from the earlier pauses in their conversation, not pregnant with unspoken arguments but heavy with mutual recognition of the vast gulf between commentary and command, between critique and responsibility. Tucker moved toward the door, his steps slower than when he had entered hours earlier. At the threshold, he turned back toward the president, who had already returned his attention to the papers covering his desk, the endless stream of decisions that couldn't wait for philosophical resolution. "Mr. President," Tucker said, his voice carrying a note of something that might have been respect, "I still believe you're wrong. But I hope you're right." Trump looked up from his papers, his expression reflecting the complex mixture of confidence and uncertainty that came with making decisions whose consequences would unfold across years and decades. "So do I, Tucker," the president said quietly. "So do I." As Tucker left the Oval Office, Trump remained alone with his decisions, the weight of leadership settling around him like a familiar but never comfortable companion. Outside the windows, Washington continued its restless existence, unaware that the future of American foreign policy had been debated and, for better or worse, decided in the quiet hours before dawn. The president reached for Patricia Rodriguez's letter once more, reading her words about sacrifice and meaning and the hope that her daughter's service would not be forgotten. In the end, Trump reflected, leadership wasn't about being right. It was about being responsible for the consequences of your choices, whatever they might be.